Hello and welcome to the Olmsted 200 Watch Party and Panel Discussion. I'm DDP Tri, President and CEO of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, the managing partner of Olmsted 200. We are delighted to have hundreds of you joining us this evening to explore the life and legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted, social reformer, journalist, and founder of the profession of American landscape architecture. If there were ever a silver lining to this pandemic, it has been the hundreds of Olmsted parks and landscapes that we could enjoy around the country. From Central Park to Yosemite and Lake Park in between, Olmsted has shaped the American landscape in ways that have impacted our lives. We, of course, take public parks for granted, but they were a radical idea brought to us by none other than Frederick Law Olmsted. And of course, these public parks didn't already exist. They were designed. We know they took generations of dedicated planning, design, and stewardship, and will require the same going forward. But many today have no idea. Olmsted's parks are so natural that people can't believe they are part of the built environment. As a consequence, too many parks and landscapes today are threatened by overuse, climate change, development, and limited resources. We cannot take these spaces for granted, and that's why we invite you to join Olmsted 200 to help us maintain and reimagine our public spaces. We are here to celebrate the physical manifestations of Olmsted's work, but even more, we're here to explore the vision and values behind them. Nearly 2 centuries ago, Olmsted came to the profound realization that thoughtful landscape design could have positive social, environmental, economic, and health impacts on people and communities. Beautiful green spaces are building blocks to healthy and livable cities. And as Olmsted would have wanted, they can also serve as vital centers of civic discourse and public protest. So now we begin the countdown to Olmsted's 200th birthday in 2022. Over the next 18 months, Olmsted 200 promises events across the country designed to inspire a national conversation about the importance of preserving historic and natural spaces for future generations. We seek to connect Americans to advance the proposition that parks are critical infrastructure that should be accessible and welcoming to all communities. We invite you to visit the campaign's website, olmsted200.org, to see our national calendar. We ask you to share your personal stories on social media, take advantage of the toolkits for advocacy and education, and enjoy our dynamic blog, Shared Spaces. Olmsted 200 celebrates a historic landmark, but we're not looking back. We're looking forward to the ways Olmsted's vision and values can inform current challenges and efforts to ensure environmental and social justice. And we're starting with tonight's panel discussion, bringing together terrific thought leaders from across the country. Please feel free to use the chat box to tell us where you are and what you're thinking. But please rely on the Q&A box to ask any questions for our panelists. We will do our best to keep our conversation to 1 hour, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end, including as many audience questions as possible. With that, it is my honor to introduce our moderator for the evening, Justin Worland. Over the course of his career, Justin has written extensively about the intersections of climate change, policy, politics, and society. I think Justin and Olmsted would be kindred spirits. Justin currently serves as senior correspondent for Time magazine. Justin, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now I'll let you take it over.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for having me. I'm really thrilled to be moderating this discussion at a very interesting time, given the conversation around the pandemic and the need for green spaces, the relevance for climate change, which is what I spend most of my time writing about, and the role that parks play in resilience, environmental resilience, but also in the fabric of communities. And of course, these are all things that are really topical in the conversation and the zeitgeist today. I just want to give one housekeeping note, which is, please submit questions through the Q&A box. I have my own questions, but it'll be a livelier discussion, I'm sure, with all of your thoughts as well. With that, I want to introduce the panel. So first, we have Justin DiBerardinis, who is the director of FDR Park in Philadelphia. And he's spent his career in community organizing and public education service. And then next we have Allegra Happy Haynes, who is the executive director of Denver Parks and Recreation. She was also, the deputy mayor and is a Denver native who served for 13 years on the city council. And finally, we have Thaisa Wei, who is the program director for landscape studies at Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection, which is a Harvard University research institution in DC. She is an urban landscape historian. Thank you all for participating in this discussion. I'm excited to dig in. So just to start really broadly, today is the 199th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted. Why do you think his vision and his values are still relevant today? What is the relevance right now in 2021? And we can just start in the order I introduced the panelists. So Justin, if you want to go first.
I think one thing I really feel in this vision, which, 100 years ago when this park was conceived, and as South Philadelphia, one of the densest urban conglomerations in America, was developing former marshlands in the south side of the city that it was being filled in, that 350 acres were set aside by park designers who had a vision for embracing water and not fighting against it and moving with the water. And that has led the park a special, I think, resilience and a special life as water tables have changed, as topographies have changed in the city. This is a wet park. This is a marsh park, but it's a park that is beautifully holds the rhythm of the design of Olmsted, and in a place in the city that is so pinched for real estate and is so dense, to create a big open palette and open format. And I would say during COVID, as much as any time, this open space has been appreciated, loved, and used in incredible ways. So I think there was a lot of vision and forethought baked into this park that still matters today.
Happy?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I would say two things about the Olmsted legacy and how relevant it still is for our parks today. First was the radical part of his idea that parks should be public spaces, that the most beautiful landscapes should be open, and we consider them the great equalizer. Nowhere else is there a place where all are welcome. And I think that is just such an important theme. The other one is that he very much viewed parks as essential infrastructure to the building of cities. And for those of us, even in cities that seem all built out and not enough room, we are all still engaged in city building. Everything we do to affect our communities, to improve them, is about city building. And it's made more difficult when land is scarce. But I really think that embracing that notion that he had so long ago, and somehow still is not necessarily a central theme in many cities, is that parks are an essential part of a city's infrastructure.
Right. Okay, well, and Thaisa.
I think there are two pieces from Olmsted's work that not only remain still relevant, but in fact are still compelling. And they've been implied by both Happy and Justin. And first of all is that we need places to grow democracy. Democracy does not just go in the air and somehow infiltrate our lives. We actually need places to build democracy, and parks the public realm is where we build democracy with one another. And he very much saw that. He understood. In fact, I would argue much of his work was around thinking about how to strengthen democracy and bring democracy to the people, and by bringing the people together. And the second piece, which is obviously particularly poignant right now, is his focus on public health. Now, he saw the public park as part of the lungs of the city. We've all heard that comment, but he instinctually also just understood that if cities were to be livable, which continues to be a challenge we have, which is how do we make cities as healthy places to live, the parks and the public realm, boulevards, the park systems were all going to be critical. And I would argue we're still building on that legacy and still working that out and still arguing for why these places are so incredibly important to our public health. And I think social health, physical health, mental health, really all forms of health, and democratic health, right?
Well, I would be curious to talk more about that, particularly in context of 2021 and 2020 and the pandemic, which of course, in sort of an obvious way, has given new value or new understanding of the value of green spaces, I think, to anybody who's been locked inside. But I guess I would be curious to hear you expand on that thought. You know, when you think about the health and resilience of social, communities, of public health, of economic well-being of communities, what is the relevance today? Can you update Olmsted's thinking with 2021 vision?
I'll go ahead and start, and I want to hear from my colleagues, but I want to respond to a particular piece, which is that we often refer to these parks as green spaces or open spaces. And I'm going to suggest that they're actually not very good terms, because open implies somehow that we have to fill it up, i.e., do we need a building? Do we need some, right? And we know. And green spaces, to me, undermines the richness of these places. They aren't merely just green. They are true living spaces and living environments. And I say all that to say, I think that is part of why they're so important. Yes, they're important because we can go out, we can stand 6 feet apart from one another, right? And we've learned that parks and streets, public streets, are important to that. But there are also places where we can breathe fresh air. There are also places that the wind goes through. There are also places where trees are helping to filter some of that air. All of those pieces that are part of a healthy infrastructure, part of supporting our own physical and mental health. And as I said, I don't think he always understood all of the ways that his parks work. I think we know more now. But I think that is a critically important piece. And during the pandemic, I think we're being made more aware. And I'll put it out there because I'm curious what others think. I'm also a little nervous that as we see the light at the end of the tunnel, which I do, I'm an optimist, I see the light. I hope we don't forget how important these places have been to us, and in all their complexity, not just that it's enough space to spread out. I guess that's part of what I'm saying. It's not just that we can spread out. It's actually about the vegetation. It's about the topography. It's about the views. It's about the air. But I'll defer to my colleagues.
Happy or Justin, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I would. I think the pandemic showed a couple of things that was very interesting. I was just sharing with someone today a story about how when our city shut down, people were expected to stay home, and yet people knew they could go outside, and they just by instinct they went to our parks. Like, there wasn't a public announcement, you should go to the parks, or parks are okay. It was a real built-in instinct, I think, from people living in a society, in a culture that want to be together, that want to be outside. And we also learned lessons from not only from the pandemic, but through the social unrest that occurred as well this summer, that the communities took to the parks, and parks have again an almost compelling need to come together. And where do people want to do that? In parks. So the notion of parks as the most civic of places for voice, for people to gather, for people to build community was so evident this past summer when they took to the streets, yes, and in Denver, they ended up in our Civic Center Park and in our city park. And when people needed to have a voice, needed to be able to speak up or speak out, the word went out, and where did they go? They went to our parks. And so without anyone saying it to people, people see these places as these democratic institutions that we've been talking about.
I speak to this not as someone who is an Olmsted scholar by any stretch, but just someone who's lived the last year of their life, this year of COVID and this year of unrest in Olmsted Park. I became the director of this park 2 weeks before the COVID shutdowns in March of last year. And just my whole last year has been experienced through this space. One thing that immediately struck me, this is the most radically diverse space in my life. And, I live in a fairly diverse city, and that diversity is not just racial, it is cultural, it is linguistic, and I think most unusually, it's ideological. The immediate neighborhood that surrounds this park, traditional Italian-American South Philly neighborhood, voted 4-1 for Donald Trump. It is a Republican neighborhood, but they're here in this park and they love it. You have radical anarchists who are in this park and love it. You have every shade and color of belief in between who is here. So, the diversity numbers that you could see in the aggregate for this park are incredible. Now, I'll say that diversity maybe exists in the park in a great degree of segregation. Everyone kind of finds their corner. You may have all these different constituencies using this park maybe in their own places. And I'll say sometimes there's tension on the seams. A park just a few blocks to the north of us here in Philadelphia during the powerful street movement for social justice was a site of a lot of violence between these different ideological groups. There were days of street battles that played out at Marconi Plaza, centered over a statue of Christopher Columbus that some groups thought they were defending and other groups were working to have removed in service of making that park a more welcoming and inviting space. It's only by happenstance I didn't have that flashpoint of a monument here in this park. Though I think that what I see in the Olmsted Park with both spaces that can provide space for intimacy and for a group to sort of feel that they are here to themselves, yet at the same time provide these larger format, greater spaces that we all share together. I think there actually is an architecture of integration that has been laid into this park that is in need of intentional program and activation. I think that there is an incredible thing of having people who may share very little else between them in their lives, but share a love of this space and want to contribute to this space. So I think our work in terms of park management is ensuring equity in this space and representation within this space, but also trying to find the place that people who maybe would never have worked together on a common cause almost anywhere else in their life in this city are finding that opportunity here. And there is a real human, I think sort of an activation of our souls or an activation of shared humanity that is happening through this park. And I think you felt that during COVID. I think the pressure living in a city during COVID and with the unrest of last year, that added more pressure into dense urban communities. And to see someone who was maybe experiencing that pressure differently, but still experiencing that pressure, but coming to this place in just that immediate breath. As I was here, we were all hearing "I Can't Breathe" last year, and just seeing and continuing to hear that, but to see the deep breaths that people could take side by side here, there was something really powerful in that. I don't think we've achieved anywhere near all that can be achieved here, but I think that's the mission and the work for our department is to find out how we can continue to build in programmatic architecture that supports what we were given, what we inherited from the work of the Olmsteds and previous generations of park leaders here in the city. So, yeah, I think that's just where my head went as I heard both of what Thaisa and Happy were sharing.
Yeah, well, I'd like to sort of on a related note ask a bit about as I understand it, the FDR Park draws in these diverse communities, but of course we know that people of color are much less likely to have access to green spaces. And there's a citation here from the Trust for Public Lands that BIPOC communities are parks in BIPOC communities are 5 times as crowded and half the size of parks in white communities. And of course, the Olmsted vision of parks as a democratic space would like democratic access for these parks. So I guess I'm curious, how do we begin to address these challenges here in the 21st century? How does the Olmsted vision fit into this question? And I'd open that up to anyone who wants to start. Maybe we'll start with and then go back to Happy and then Justin.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start. So I think there are a couple things that you bring up that are really important, and one is that democratic nature of the park, which I laud at one hand, and at the other hand, what democracy was seen as in 1857, I would argue is very different than what we ideally see democracy as today and who it's inclusive of. So one of the ways we need to update his, I would call, very good intention of democracy is really think about what democracy looks like today. And one of the ways that we need to do that is think about where parks are. I've been a big advocate. I like the idea of parks being, within the 10-minute walk, but it matters how big the park is, what the density is, what services, how well it's maintained. It's more than just how close it is. So we have to pay attention to all the nuances of parks and really think about their access, their capacity. I also want to put out that Olmsted had a particular view that he shared with many people of what was appropriate public behavior. And I think we would argue for a much more diverse and inclusive idea of what's okay for parks. And that's something we have to be designing parks for a broader range of activities, and understanding there's some activities we can't even predict, but we need to be able to incorporate and see our parks grow. And on the one hand, I'll say that I think Olmsted parks have been particularly adaptable to all sorts of new, he didn't set out for them to be places of protest, but they certainly have been, or places of gathering after natural disasters, and they certainly have been. But I think we can push that farther and think more creatively to truly address the broad range of the community that ought to be able to find a place in the parks. One last, because you mentioned it, a whole issue of people of color being less likely, and I'm going to say it's because I think we have not done a good enough job making sure they're equally welcomed, and that we reach out to communities and serve them in the parks. I think it takes many to be in a relationship, so I think it's our responsibility to also think about the parks and how are we welcoming communities.
And to add to that, the diversity of FDR Park is special. I don't think it's the result of anything incredible we've done in a parks department to make it welcoming. I think it is a reflection that South Philadelphia, as one of the great immigrant arrival points for American cities for over 100 years now, just possesses that diversity. And this is the only big park. Like, this is the only park that's, you couldn't throw a baseball across the length of this game in town. So that I think diversity is here in some ways, despite a track record of not always being the most welcoming, as a park system or in terms of our management styles. But it is a great gift that diversity is here. There is not always equity in terms of which real estate different communities occupy. Behind me is sort of the Olmsted core of the park with, I think, some of the iconic architecture and the best access to water. Certain communities, more longer standing South Philadelphia communities, or maybe even communities that have had more, newer communities that have more affluence, have claimed more of a deeper ownership of this space. You go to the south side of the park close to 95, the interstate as it comes through. That's not the most aesthetically pleasing part of the park, but in many ways, that's where all the magic is happening. This park has an incredible street food, unlicensed vendor scene. On a weekend, you will find 90 Southeast Asian and Latin American street food vendors and incredible community gathering places and expressions occurring. I think our challenge is a multi-decade master plan to rebuild it, are we rebuilding, reimagining a park that are actually supporting these uses? And these uses are challenging. Unlicensed vending is more difficult to think how we create a sustainable and workable system that works for these immigrant and new arrival communities than it is just to put a restaurant vendor in the park. That's much harder. But those are the challenges that I'm glad that this administration and this Parks Department is taking on, and really has put me in a position to work to help with communities as they're organizing. I'm so glad to see after this year of COVID, this immigrant vendor community organizing, forming an association across linguistic, racial and cultural lines, saying they need permanent home within the plan that the city is developing. I think those are the generations of new imaginings of use, of new imaginings of how people will express themselves in the place. And I'm glad that I work for a Parks Department that's committed to that, but that is hard work. But at the same time, I do think the fundamentals of what's here, the fundamental, like I said, that architecture of integration that is just rooted in this park is such a beautiful palette to try to express these new ideas on. But I think they're incredibly challenging, difficult questions of equity. Money always has the advantage. And so how do we create systems where folks who are not leading with millions of dollars have just as much of a say or more of a say in the direction of the park than the money does. And I do think we're taking great strides in that respect, but it is incredibly challenging and inspiring work to be a part of.
Happy, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I do. I love this question about equity and where we are. It's not surprising that many of the Olmsted-inspired parks in Denver are surrounded by our wealthier neighborhoods. There are larger regional parks, and it came about in the early development of the city, and so it has been a challenge as we build out our system in newer neighborhoods, less affluent neighborhoods. The land is scarcer. It's been hard to, it's hard to build a very, very large park along the scale of many of the traditional Olmsted parks in some of the neighborhoods. I will say that in Denver, we've taken a really strong focus around the issue of equity in the past couple of years as a part of our new game plan, our strategic plan, which is really focused on serving our underserved communities, so our ideas even of using the parks and how they're used, and Thaisa raised that issue, and Olmsted had this very pastoral, kind of an idea about parks, came out of his own background, which was fairly privileged. In my neighborhood, one of our largest city park, we have people who enjoy that experience, and people who like to drive their cars, their lowriders, or their cars with the windows open and the music blaring, and their picnic. And we even coming out of the pandemic, where we closed some roads to provide more space, and we've since reopened some of them. We've gotten a lot of feedback from many who want to keep the roads closed, no cars. And yet that has raised some real differences among racial differences, cultural differences about how people use the park and how diverse our users are. And so right at the heart of how we manage these spaces, and whether there are roads or there are not roads, and what activities can be allowed and not, has everything to do with real, true democracy. And so I want to add a point about that. Democracy in parks today means for us that the people in the community actually help us to co-create the spaces. So many of our Olmsted parks were part of his vision, and they're brilliant. And we love them. But when you create a park and design it with the people who live in that area or who are part of it, there's a different outcome. And that is something that we have to be open to as we build parks of the future.
Can I add to that, Justin?
Please, yeah.
I just think Happy made such an important, I want to underscore, for Olmsted, he made each park different, but it was much more in response to the environment and the sort of what we think of as landscape issues, and less about social differences. And I think today we know we have to co-create because those social and cultural differences also need to be read in our public realm. So I think that's such an important way in which we can expand on Olmsted's work with all the incredible community engaged work that so many of our professionals and academics and advocates and leaders are engaged in. I'd like to think Olmsted would be right on board with us, but certainly it's a really important part, I think, of our work of building on his legacy. So thank you, Happy. That was.
Well, I just want to remind everyone we have about 9 minutes before question and answer, the audience question and answer. So please do submit questions if you have them. So we've been talking a lot about social resilience, community resilience, and I want to ask a bit about environmental resilience. And I know this is something that Olmsted thought about, of course, in his time. So it was a sort of different conversation, but he thought about environmental resilience to a great degree. And so I'm just curious, how do you think about that in the 21st century? Obviously, we have climate change and we have a whole set of concerns around that. How does the Olmsted vision apply, and how do you think about updating that for climate challenges? Maybe we'll start with Happy just to mix it up this time.
Sure. When I think of resilience and what we are facing in parks today to respond to the climate crisis, and it's an important part of our game plan, high priority for us to think of our parks as answers to the issues of climate change. And it means thinking a little differently about landscapes, certainly differently than what many of our traditional Olmsted parks. And particularly out here in the West, his parks and the dream of his parks tended to have, again, that woods kind of feeling, the experience that he grew up with. In the high plains desert of Denver, what is resilience and what is going to respond to climate change and responsible use of water resources where they are very limited. Means some very different things, and so again, I think he had a really radical idea in many ways of responding to the environment and to the flooding issues and so on. But I think today we have to take it to a new level in making our parks not only serve as the lungs, but in our instance, parks have to be contribute to flood control. They have to be lots of different places. We see our parks as a place to reintroduce pollinators in an environment where we're rapidly losing that kind of landscape. And so resilience looks a little different in the 21st century than it did 200 years ago.
And just as counterpoint to Happy's geography, I am very low and wet down here in FDR Park. I'm at the confluence of two major tidal rivers. The lowest point in my park is 8 feet below sea level. So our challenges, I think resiliency here starts with, I believe that the core design of this park was so cognizant of water and water flow and how these waterways would connect up. I think the first step in reestablishing the resilience here is undoing some of the damaging decisions that were made over the last 100 years for this park. Many of these waterways, which were designed to connect together, to have drainage into these tidal rivers, were segregated off, dams were built, water was held up in spaces. These decisions have proved disastrous for the ecology of the park. We're certainly in a situation where both this area is subsiding. It was made as new land and filled in 100 years ago, and the river levels are rising. The tidal ranges where we're situated are about 7 feet is how high the tides move up and down each day. The first step for the restoration of this park begins with the restoration of 40 acres of tidal marshland. That is the first thing we needed to do to bring this park back. So this marsh space was not necessarily in the vision of Olmsted. In some ways, I think they sort of fought out of the marsh, dry land, and more clearly defined wetlands and lakes. And I think something we're adding in with more of a 21st century awareness of hydrology and how water needs to move and the importance of marshes is to put back 40 acres of marshes at the drainage point of this park. So I think it's, if we can take down the dams, if we can get the water flowing the way it needs again, if we can imagine a park that is more connected with uncertain space between land and water, I think that's the challenge for us in park management here in Philadelphia and in this park specifically, is comfort in the uncomfortable spaces of wetlands, lands that are not necessarily made for the human being first, but have so much to offer to human beings and have incredible necessity just in the drainage of South Philadelphia. I think those are the places that we're going to need to go from a design standpoint. I'm so I've just been thrilled, and I'm still waiting for a good photo of it, but there is now a river otter living in the lakes of FDR Park. This is probably the first otter to live in South Philadelphia in over a century. So I think that is something which gives me hope about a new integration of ecology and human access, as the park is teeming with people. You know, the park has perhaps not seen this many people since the mid-20th century, and at the same time still has room for really diverse and complex biology, and ecology is really an amazing thing. And I think those are the lines, these sort of uncomfortable and hard to suss out spaces between humans and nature, that's where the work's going to be for us.
Wait, I would build on that and say, I think a great opportunity for parks around climate resilience is education. You know, one of the challenges in climate change is it's hard to see, right? We talk about, scientists talk about it. We anecdotally, it's warmer, it's colder. Parks are a place where we can start to see it. I mean, I would argue being out of doors, engaged in the outdoor environment allows us to see it. And parks are a remarkable public place where we together can see the waters rising or see the otter, which is totally awesome. I tell my husband, who grew up in Philadelphia, there's a river otter. But, you know, I just think parks are remarkable, not only to respond to climate, and we're seeing parks have to do that, rethink their trees, you know, what vegetation they're growing, rethink water levels, but also engage people in being able to see and understand those changes and what it takes to make a difference and to make change. And then I also think it gets back right to the beginning of this discussion, which is parks are part of what makes cities livable, and they're part of our response to a better, more carbon responsible future, right? Where we're truly stewarding our environment and not just extracting from it. And parks are an important part of that.
Excellent. Well, I think I'm going to move on. We have a good number of audience questions, so I'm going to move on to them a little bit early. One question here, basically, the questioner writes that she finds it difficult or frustrating that it's so hard to gain respect and funding from elected leaders for parks, and asks what should we be doing collectively to make a difference to help fund parks. So thoughts? I guess.
I'll start.
Yeah.
Justin, as a city, you just recently passed a sales tax initiative to to provide a dedicated source of funding for our parks, in addition to the general fund that we receive already from the city. And there was a lot of that kind of frustration and a sentiment in our community, a little Rodney Dangerfield feeling about parks aren't well respected and enough as part of the city. And I know when we were preparing our game plan, we did it in conjunction with our planning department and with our Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. The idea being to, again, to plant that seed that parks are essential infrastructure. And when you look at the response to climate issues, and I think that is a lever in communities, the health benefits and the necessity of parks for health reasons. And so Thaisa talked about education, parks and education. And I think education about parks and their benefits, it can really help. And I know it is what, I mean, we had an overwhelming vote by the citizens to tax themselves, as large a tax increase as we've ever seen for parks. And that was a real testament to people understanding how essential they are for health, how essential they are as a part of our city's ability to be resilient and to respond to the climate challenges that we face. So I would urge the person to use education about parks and their benefits. I think it's overwhelming, and most people from their own personal experiences will resonate to those messages.
Yeah, I would quickly add to that, and I know Justin will have more to say. I think we also need to educate to think about park systems. I think too often we advocate for the park in our neighborhood. And if we can actually think about advocating for equity of parks across all neighborhoods, then we can get all neighborhoods behind. And too often we tend to gather around our park, whatever our park is. And it should be the whole system and the whole city.
And I'm never reached the level that Happy has in politics, but my sort of career started in community organizing and in the kind of bare knuckles local political world here in Philadelphia. And I think the lessons that I've took from those spaces into parks is like the funding decisions that our cities make are currently an expression of the coalitions and powers that already exist and are being brought to bear on decision makers. And if you want to see more funding for the park, if you want to see more funding for, these ecological priorities, these democratic priorities of public space, you're going to need to build a new coalition that is not just the usual suspects that your council members or your mayors are typically hearing from. Everyone is using the parks, I think, in Philadelphia, but not everyone is engaged. If you're looking at who is advocating for the parks, it is a much, much more slender cut. And I think what I see, political actors respond when they see something new. When they see a coalition of users who are not usually together, stout together and say, we need X for FDR Park or we need X for our park system, that's when I see people taking notice. I think a big portion of my work and effort has been to be an ally and a supporter of these authentic organizing efforts that have been happening in this park in the last year, whether it is those, immigrant vendor community, whether that are other communities that have been pushed to the edge, whether that's communities that are really believing that the ecological aspects of the park are underserved. The stronger those communities are, even if they don't agree with every decision my park system is making, if I have strong communities advocating for this park, we are going to see more resources, more support, more political backing for the park, and good things are going to happen. So there's a sharing of power when more people are at the table. There is a more complex pictures of voices and demands. Those are all hard to navigate, but that's how you're going to achieve really, really big, hard to reach things in public space. So be a part of something bigger than you are. Figure out how you can work with folks who don't necessarily look like you or share every belief that you have. And in so doing, you're going to be a part of a coalition that's going to get something done.
Well, we have a sort of a related question in some ways. As Happy mentioned, reminded us, parks are infrastructure. What provisions and plans should we be supporting in the new administration's infrastructure plan? And how can we ensure that parks are prioritized over other infrastructure, like say highways, which have ruined some Olmsted parks? But I think the big question here, of course, is just, what can people be looking for from the federal government to help support parks in this moment? And I don't know if any.
That is a great question, and something that we've spent a lot of time in our city thinking about. And of course, when people say infrastructure, the first thing that comes to mind is roads and bridges. I don't think that we can afford going forward to be engaged in the battle or the trade-off, if you will, between whether roads need to be repaired and bridges need to be repaired or parks built. I think we've got to have a both and strategy with our leaders, but they need to hear from local communities. I know I've got some meetings scheduled coming up soon with our congressional delegation to let them know. And I will say, right on the heels of the reauthorization of LWCF, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and permanent funding for that, I think all of us who are in the business of parks and open spaces and green infrastructure have to build on the momentum of that. I think a monumental decision that was just made, and carry it over into the decisions that are being made about restoring our communities. This is what this infrastructure bill is about, and we cannot restore our cities without the essential quality of life components that parks provide. Again, the climate resilience, the air and water quality benefits, the health benefits. And I think really driving home those messages with our congressional representatives from local communities is going to be essential to letting them know that it isn't just about the ribbons of highways, but it's about the quality of life. Where do people want to be? And I use this example regularly in my own community when I think of some of the tree-lined boulevards that we have that are parkways, and where people prefer even to drive. And it is in an environment where there are trees, there's a parkway, it draws people naturally. And so these are essential to building the kind of place that people want to live in. And that's why infrastructure should be in the service of the quality of life for all of its residents.
I would just add to that, because I think that was a fantastic answer. Parks are also part of a system like roads. And I think we just need to also think about parks not as sort of one-offs and one here, one there, but think about them like we do roads and all of our other infrastructure. And then we would start to understand that we have to support the whole system. And they need attention just like our other infrastructural systems do.
Yes.
And that's what I would demand, in the same way that this leadership is already expanding how they think about infrastructure. I would love them to start to think about parks and our public realm. I mean, I'm going to also include all the little parklets and corners and circles and, frankly, sidewalks. How do we think about the urban landscape, the public realm as a system?
I think just the very little I would add. I'm heartened here in Philadelphia that I feel like this last year has really reinforced that parks are essential infrastructure and that parks departments are essential services. So after some really horrific cuts that the city of Philadelphia had to do during COVID, this is one of the first departments that's heading for a full restoration of budget. I don't think that happens if people's relationship, understanding, and experience of parks hadn't changed. I hope that can penetrate at a national level. So I'm heartened to see it here in Philadelphia, and I hope that reimagining of the role of parks in our lives can keep moving forward in other spaces too.
So we have time, I think, for one more question, and I'm just thinking of the otter here, but the question here is, it's also J.J. Audubon's birthday today, which I did not know. To what extent did Olmsted consider birds or other animals to fit into the landscape? And then, of course, I would be curious, to update that again today. How should we be thinking about parks, animals in the context of parks today?
Well, I'll jump in and say, so he did think about birds and animals. He thought sort of ecologically. We would think in more complex ways today, but he certainly thought about it. And that is exactly, again, going back to an earlier discussion, parks provide a lot more than grass and trees. or baseball fields, and they actually provide hopefully healthy environments, holistic environments that are connected in with the city, that are connected in with the water and the air and the animals, and provide corridors and pathways for birds. And we were talking, now's the moment of migration, a huge migration for bird watchers. I'm just a new bird watcher, but it's a pretty exciting moment to learn your birds. And those birds that are migrating depend a lot on things like parks to be able to land and rest. And so he was certainly aware of it, but I think we're even more aware of it, and we have to be even more careful and thoughtful. And realize again that parks do a lot more than just provide us a place to be 6 feet apart from one another, or provide us a playground, or whatever it is that's our immediate concern. They are long-term, deeply complex, deeply contributing places to our well-being and all that means.
Yeah. It's funny. I remember having a debate with somebody not long ago about why we shouldn't allow people in the parks at night overnight. And I was reminding them that those parks do serve as essential habitat for some of our urban wildlife, and they deserve a break from humans. And they were taken aback by that suggestion, but it underscores that and it's difficult in densely urban communities to have a reasonable habitat for any kind of wildlife is very challenging. And I think it's one of the things that really has inspired us as we think about introducing more nature into our parks. And even in some of our parks that are much more landscape, we're considering conversions to more natural environments. Again, bringing the pollinator gardens in, bringing water and using water in a way that will, entice more wildlife to coexist. And it brings me back to a point that you made earlier about education and about stewardship. And urban parks aren't places where conservation is going to occur just because they're really tough. But it is where the idea of conservation and the advocacy and the stewards that are necessary for building conservation in the landscapes where it does matter, it begins in our parks. And so they're an essential part of educating our community about the world we live in and how we're going to keep it living in harmony with it. And so a little trickle of a stream, even if it's not a natural one, that can create that natural environment so that kids can learn about what lives in the water and how water is cleaned by the vegetation and along the edges. And all of those things are important to think about from an educational standpoint in terms of building the environmental stewards of the future.
Last thought about the otter or otherwise?
I would just say I've seen that the most complex expressions of nature and wildlife take hold in the sections of the park we kind of neglect or forget or lose track of. It's sort of these edges that get overgrown, or the place that's by the highway, so maybe it's not kind of prime time for people, and that's where things take off. In our park right now, there was 200 acres of this park was a golf course 2 years ago. That's now 2 years into renaturalizing, and the foxes and the deer and the diversity of migrating birds you see over there is staggering. I think we can make really intentional decisions. I think our decision to put 40 acres of restored tidal wetland in here, this is acreage that is not principally for humans. To make tide marches, to make space that is principally for animals and migratory birds and for plants, and believe that there's room for that within our parks. I know not every park's 350 acres. It's only our largest parks that have that ability. But I think even at small scales, setting or thinking about how there are constituencies beyond the human constituency that we care for in this park, I thought Happy really laid that out beautifully. And I think we see that on the ground here.
Well, thank you for that. This was a great discussion. I'm going to just invite the three panelists to give a brief, closing 30, 45-second remarks, just if they have any closing thoughts before I toss it back to DDP Tribe. But, Justin, if you want to start.
I guess where my head goes is I just go to seeing how I didn't know when I took this job how spiritually important this space would be for a section of the city during the time of COVID. And I was just so moved to see so many different people, coming here. And just like I said, that first breath when they entered the park, like that just was sort of the thread that animated every day of my life in this park. That the person gets out of their car or they walk in, and no matter what the temperature or the pressure was going on, just that, and I think we need to be stewards of that moment. We have to be stewards of that breath. And I think everyone who's working in parks, I feel like that's when we're doing our highest and best and noblest works.
Happy?
When I think about the Olmsted legacy and, the ideas of democracy, and today, Olmsted was successful in large part because he was in the right place at the right time, knew the right people, came a little bit from a place of privilege. There, I believe, are hundreds of thousands of Olmsteds in our communities today, who, with the kind of engagement and some of the ideas, can take our parks to a new level. And be inspired by many of the same reasons that he was, but be inspired to build and to continue and to protect and grow our park system. I'm going to take your advice, Thaisa, but talking about our park systems to a new level when we think of them being as essential infrastructure for our cities.
So I think from my closing, I think the democracy, the legacy of these democratic places, and then rethinking what that democracy looks like in 2021, because I think we all acknowledge it. It looks different. And I think our view of it as a much more inclusive and welcoming for truly what we think of as all people is really important. And we haven't done that yet. But I also want to note something that we didn't get a chance to talk about, which is that these lands have been stewarded by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. And we could learn a lot about stewarding the land. And one of the things I think we do is we sometimes, again, think of these parks as sort of what can they do for me? What can they do for my neighborhood? And we could be starting to think about what can we do for these parks as part of stewarding the land and working in partnership with those communities who've been stewarding land for far longer than we as Europeans have been here. And I think parks are, again, a wonderful place to have that discussion and to think about what that would look like. And to me, that's another form of thinking about the democratic future and the power of parks, which clearly all three of us are pretty taken by the power of public parks. What a remarkable legacy.
Well, what a great note to end on. This has been a really interesting discussion. Ordinarily, I would offer a summary, but I feel like we are short on time, so I'll hand back off to DDP Tribe. But I appreciate the audience. I appreciate the thoughtful conversation. Really a pleasure to moderate.
Well, thank you, Justin. I want to say it has been a knockout conversation. I knew we would have some provocative ideas, and in fact, we have. And I just want to thank Justin and all of our panelists for joining us this evening and for the ideas that they have put out for us to be thinking about as we enter into the countdown to Olmsted 200. I hope we will all feel inspired after this conversation to get outside and visit amazing parks and landscapes and to thank all of those who are stewarding them. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the Messner family for allowing us to air this documentary, as well as a big thanks for our Olmsted 200 Honorary Committee, founding partners, and sponsors for your generous support of the Olmsted 200 campaign. So as we begin the countdown, please remember, explore our website for more information. Learn about not only Olmsted's parks, but the many and diverse landscapes that he designed across the country. Watch for our blog posts and take advantage of our toolkits for advocacy and education. Tell the students in your family to learn more about Olmsted and enter into our essay competition. We have fantastic plans in the works and look forward to partnering with all of you. Our next Olmsted 200 event will take place on May 18th. I invite you to join us at 2 p.m. for the first installment of our new series, Conversations about Olmsted. And this one will focus on Olmsted's trip to the South as a roving reporter for the New York Times. Professor Charles Waldheim from the Harvard Graduate School of Design will moderate, and he'll be joined by landscape architect and Olmsted 200 honorary committee member Sarah Zodi and John Stauffer, professor of African American Studies at Harvard as well. Registration details will be live on our website soon, so make sure to check out olmsted200.org and subscribe to our newsletter so that you can stay up to date with all the things that are happening in the part of the campaign. We hope you'll continue to support this initiative throughout the next year. Please join us, whether by hosting your own event, enjoying events across the country, protecting an Olmsted landscape, or just following us on social media at Olmsted 200. Let's raise a glass to Olmsted on his birthday. And thank you again, everyone, and good night.